Now, here at home, the government's anti-corruption czar, John Penrose, has written to the business secretary, warning the government risks distorting the economy and encouraging cronyism unless it opens up its new subsidy system to more transparency. John Penrose, who's an MP, of course, as well as being the corruption czar, is on the line now. John, evening.
Hi, John.
John, could you just set out your worries, if you would?
Yeah, it's not just about cronyism. It's also about the danger that that subsidies can distort competition, can just make British business and British exports less competitive, can mean that you and I as consumers and your listeners as consumers are more likely to get ripped off. If you have subsidies which are, it doesn't matter who's in government, they are a sort of heady political drug, an option for politicians to spend taxpayers' money, often not terribly wisely, on commercially hopeless ideas because it's politically sexy at the time. So there are potentially dangerous, although quite important and if done right, still useful things. So we've got to get our system right. We used to have the same one as the rest of the EU. That's what we've inherited as we left the EU, and very sensibly, Kwasi Kwarteng and the Prime Minister and others are saying we need to sort of put our mark on this. We need to improve on this, and I think we can. I think they're right, and they're trying to make it a great deal more nimble, a great deal less bureaucratic. All of which is really, really sensible. I'm sort of thoroughly on side with it. The wrinkle that they've got to get fixed, though, is we've got to make sure that we can all see what subsidies are being dished out. Otherwise, that way lies, the potential for misuse in future.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic has been an unprecedented crisis. The response from the state and from government has had to be, well, as nimble as it conceivably could contrive. But is it also fair to say that worries or allegations and controversies about contracts during that COVID period, cronyism has been associated with those, or at least some of those contracts? Has that made this argument you're putting forward more urgent, John?
Well, oddly, they're already acting about the contracts bit, because that's about government contracting and commissioning. And there's actually a separate piece of legislation which they're also bringing forward to make that really transparent anyway. So that bit, funnily enough, is a sort of it's in the field next door, but it isn't actually bang on the money here. They are doing the right things there, and really what I'm saying is, look, you're doing the right things for contracting and commissioning. Let's do the right thing for subsidies too, and then you've got the full team.
So there are concerns that naturally overlap between those two fields. As you put it. When it comes to subsidies, you don't want someone to have a fast track into government to be able to do better with subsidies than the company next door, which may have a perfectly good, valid or equal case. Yeah. For so many years, in this country, we have enjoyed a reputation of our public life at the highest level, at the high levels, being thought of as pretty straight, as being pretty corruption-free, not so susceptible to this kind of thing, the corrosive effects of a reputation for cronyism, say. Do you think that reputation is as strong as it was, or is it wobbling a bit?
I think the danger is actually not so much to do with cronyism, and I think this other piece of legislation, which we just mentioned about dealing with government contracting, will sort of reinforce that. You're right, that traditional image, but I think that it's much more. The danger is much more just of people being really good lobbyists, and particularly if they've got deep pockets and they can afford good lawyers and good lobbyists, and they persuade politicians with the best will in the world to make decisions with subsidies, throwing taxpayers' cash around, which turns out to be a really bad idea in hindsight a few years later. And so it's much less a concern. I mean, we shouldn't ignore, obviously, the issue about corruption and cronyism, of course not, but it's also to do with honest mistakes that turn out to be a thoroughgoing useless waste of money, and they count too, and both of these things matter.
Yeah, I mean, so when it comes to those subsidies, those straightforward, as it were, subsidies, Brexit was presented as offering new opportunities to be more nimble when it came to dealing with the state, dealing with business, and including subsidies where that's appropriate. And things like the high-tech sector was seen as something where Britain could capitalise on an advantage over competitors elsewhere. But it's also worth pointing out, John, isn't it, that, well, when you're trading with Europe, if you are seen or judged by Europe to be behaving excessively in granting subsidies, you've got a problem there too.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things is that regardless of how your listeners all voted in the Brexit referendum, one of the things which most people thought that the EU was relatively good at was in controlling subsidies. It was a bit bureaucratic. It's a bit sort of laden with red tape, but they were pretty good at stopping some of the more ridiculous ones going on. Nobody's perfect, and that means that if we get this right, we can still improve. We can be more virtuous than them. But if we get it wrong and we become by accident or design less good at it than them, less good at controlling subsidies, then we might trip up when we try and export to them. Absolutely right. So it makes sense on both sides to get this right and to do the right thing.
So what sort of feedback have you had so far on your report? Have you had positive feedback from within government?
So far, I've had a couple of initial conversations with ministers saying, look, this is a very small change, which I think it wouldn't be difficult to make to this upcoming piece of legislation. And it's good news because it also reduces red tape. It reduces the cost of doing business. It just makes life easier for everybody all round. They've gone away to think about it, and it certainly wasn't where they were starting from. So they've had to sort of, promise me to come back and have a look and then let me know. But the interesting thing is that it's got a lot of support from a really wide and unusual coalition of people outside Parliament. So we've got traditional conservative free market think tanks, people like the Centre for Policy Studies and the Taxpayers Alliance and people like that. Plus, we've also got the anti-corruption NGOs, so people like Transparency International and others, all on the same side. Now, that's not a very common coalition in politics in Britain, and the fact that everybody on all sides is saying this is just an unalloyed good thing. It's not a party political thing. It's not a left versus right thing. It's just the right thing to do in order to make our economy work better and to, as you rightly pointed out, keep our hard-won reputation for being a pretty honest sort of country most of the time. Let's try and do this because it's just a sort of a bit of a no-brainer if we can get it right.
Okay, John, thank you. That's the Conservative MP, John Penrose, who's also the anti-corruption czar.